My name is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the 11th Sunday after Pentecost for the week of August 24th, 2025. I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to dig in this week's podcast. And I'm excited because we're at a really interesting crossroads. One, we should have a special episode dropping here later this week, announcing something that I've been working on for a long time, and it's just time to really get that released. And this is episode number 399, which means after next week, I'll look at releasing kind of a summary. And I think there's a lot of things I kind of need to get into and kind of talk about. And I'd really want to hear some feedback on, especially in the next couple weeks. There's just a lot of things that are going on, a lot of things kind of going on behind the scenes. And I just really want to talk about it. I want to get some of that out there, and I want to have some of that feedback. We're at this exciting point. We're approaching 400 consecutive weeks, which is crazy to think about, and just different things that I think are worth talking about, and that's exciting in and of itself. So it's an exciting period of time, and again, we're in this season after Pentecost, so we're in a growing phase of our own faith, which is also extremely exciting. But let's just jump into the question that we had for last week, which was, what is something you're going to do to change to help our planet? I think it's really easy for us to minimize these changes. I know there's a sense of urgency, and I know there's a thing that we need to be doing and making those moves faster and quicker and happen. But I think there's also the aspect of don't minimize the simple changes. And especially kind of some of the things that we're going to be getting into a little bit this week, it's really easy for us to say, I can't make this big extravagant change, thus I'm not going to do anything. And that's not the point. The point is if we make small changes, it helps make the bigger changes easier. And the more of those little changes you do, the more and more you experience, the more and more you understand that this isn't drastic. This isn't something that's just going to dramatically change how I look at things and how I do things. Instead, it allows for you to actually start taking those steps and realizing, yeah, this is very possible, and helps build momentum. And in doing that, it makes things more manageable and just more possible. And especially if you are able to be an example then for others, it allows for it not to just be a movement of you, but a movement of multiple people, and thus being able to spread your work out more and more. So let's just jump into it. One of the Old Testament texts this week is from Jeremiah chapter 1, verses 4 to 10. And these texts this week, as you'll find, a lot of them are centralizing around the idea of taking Sabbath. And in this text, it's the recognition that God formed us and God has been with us since the beginning, and that we need to allow for God to be able to speak, for us to be able to understand then what is being spoken to us. And sometimes, yes, that exposes within us as we get here that there's still parts of us that still need to mature. There's still parts of us that need to be able to grow. But the Lord then is going to still utilize us. The Lord understands this and is able to guide us through some of these difficult times when we feel that we're inadequate. And the psalm that goes with that then is Psalm 71, the first 6 verses of that. And this is a recognition then in my weakness, in those times, that God is continuing to be that rock and that fortress, the one who gets me through those difficult periods, the one who is able to help me and guide me when I'm going through those hard times. And in doing that, it allows for us as a collective group to be able to recognize that God continues to do that for each of us. And so putting our trust in and recognizing that God has been there from the beginning to be able to guide us through difficult times. The other alternative Old Testament text this week is out of Isaiah chapter 58, starting with verse 9b and going through 14. And this is recognizing that, one, God continues to satisfy even as we are going through a time of Sabbath, and we're taking that. And so thus, as we are doing these things and recognizing how God continues to satisfy us in those times, it means that we need to make sure that we are continuing to give time to the Sabbath, that we are taking that time in which to be holy, set apart, taking that time for God to be able to work in and amongst and within us. And it's very easy for us to kind of push that aside or say, this isn't important, or there's other things that I need to be doing. And this is one of these moments where Isaiah is really kind of trying to true us back in and say, no, this is vitally important, and recognize how God has continued to do that for you and taking care of you. Thus, this is not something that you just push aside. This is something that you welcome in. The psalm that goes with that then is Psalm 103, the first 8 verses of it. And this is then recognizing that in doing that, it allows us to actually bless the Lord. It allows us to be able to see the benefits of what is going on. It allows us to be able to put aside these different stresses of the day, these different things that are bearing us down, and actually truly be lifted up and truly be in the presence of God through this aspect. That then we are allowing ourselves to actually spend time with God, not allowing these other things in, allowing us to actually set apart some of that time. And in doing that, we are able to better understand where God is trying to guide us and be able to better understand the character of who God is to begin with. The epistle text or second reading this week is out of Hebrews chapter 12, starting at verse 18 to 29. This kind of continues on this theme on how, yes, we have gone through and had Christ go on our behalf, but it's then recognizing what that actually is. If Christ is going on before us to be the tempest, to be the person who is truly preparing the way, is helping to purify us, then why aren't we then making sure that we are doing that same to God? That we are giving our best to God, that we are setting aside that time, that we are making sure that we are going through the practices. Jesus has gone through and taken care of a lot of these things to have this new covenant with us. The covenant that is within us, that is embedded within us, has this desire then that we have relationship with God. And if we are missing that relationship, it's hard for us to be able to fully accept and be part of this covenant in which we are called into. That we don't have a God necessarily just be fearing anymore. It's this God that wants to have a relationship with us, to be able to walk with us, to guide with us as we are going through the trials and tribulations of life, that God is walking with us. And in doing that, we have awe and reverence for God. And this then allows us to be able to show praise. The gospel text this week is out of Luke chapter 13, verses 10 to 17. And this, I think, is a very important text in and of itself. It's during the Sabbath, there are teachings going on, and a woman appears who has been crippled for 18 years. Jesus comes up to her, asks her if she wants to be freed from her ailment, and Jesus heals her. And this then enrages the Pharisees. And in doing so, they're stating there's 6 other days to do work. Why are you doing this work on the Sabbath? This is supposed to be God's day. And Jesus calls out and says, you hypocrites, what are you talking about? You still untie your ox and your donkey and lead it to water and make sure it is fed. Why am I not able to do the same thing? This woman has been bound by Satan for 18 years. Do you not think then I should be able to heal this person, instead of her being bound up in this and being able to rejoice in that? And that is kind of where we are left. This leaves all these other people around just in amazement and rejoicing in what Jesus had done, but it also leaves us at this moment of what is going on with the Pharisees and how are they reacting to this news. So before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we have to do a shameless plug. Working Preacher. If you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it. Between the Sermon Brainwaves podcasts, or commentaries, or discussions, since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help give me some ideas and directions and ways to be looking at and thinking about these texts in a new and creative way. So if you haven't checked out workingpreacher.org, I'd highly recommend it. I'd also highly recommend checking out the revised common lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. I really enjoy how they lay out the text week to week, along with having art, prayers, hymns, daily devotions, liturgical colors. This is a powerhouse resource to be able to really help you prepare week to week to make sure that you are in this rhythm of helping to, when you sit down in those pews, you are prepared for what's happening. You've heard this stuff. You can go just that little bit deeper. And I think this is, again, an amazing time of year to be looking at and thinking about doing that. This is that growing season. This is an amazing time to really dig in. And I know school in some parts of the country has already started. In other parts of the world, it's still just about to start. It's time to get into studying. Let's dig in a little bit deeper here as we're into kind of the second half here of that season after Pentecost. Finally, I'd also highly recommend checking out the Green Plates Preaching Roundtable and the Green Plates Rising publication. This is either a weekly reflection or a monthly newsletter that includes a lot of these reflections going through the ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies on things to be talking about with these texts. If you enjoy listening to me each week talk about this stuff, I know you're going to enjoy these resources. So I'd highly recommend checking out the Green Plates Preaching Roundtable and the Green Plates Rising publications, and that'll be the first link down in the show notes. Whenever we hear the Pharisees, especially in today's context, I think there's a lot of times that it's easy for us to just glaze over and realize that in whatever is happening, the Pharisees are going to be doing something wrong. And I think it's easy for us to miss that there's sometimes things that are going on that we are mimicking still because we have already victimized the Pharisees. I would argue there's some of this, doesn't matter what type of church denomination you're a part of, that we have made certain things idols, per se. That we have made, in this case, the Sabbath is what Jesus is talking about, that we have idolized it to the point where it's lost all meaning, and it's not truly what it's about. What we're trying to get to with the Sabbath is having this time to be able to connect directly with God. Instead, we have made it into this moment where it's, you don't do anything, it's this very holy day, and take your seat and just let God be, and that is part of honoring God. And I think there's certain ways when we look at how we do church, no matter which denomination, I think there's times where this has become the norm, instead of us really utilizing this time to go just that little bit deeper. And that also means slowing down to get to that point. That means stopping and being able to rationalize and think about what is going on. And in doing that, we sometimes actually get the insight that we're looking for. We have multiple texts this week talking to us about how we need to be making sure that we are keeping the Sabbath. And I'd argue that I have found an example where science helps back up this point. And it's been something that I would argue almost everybody listening to this has benefited from the scientific discovery in some form or fashion. Most of us probably directly, but if not directly, I can almost guarantee indirectly. And that is the discovery of penicillin. Now, there is a lot of things that we can be getting into with this. In fact, we know that from history that there had been multiple different even communities of people, along with multiple different scientists who had talked about that they had noticed some properties of penicillin, but there really wasn't anything going on. They noticed there were some antibacterial properties to penicillin, but they weren't able to really pursue them. There was other pursuits, and so thus it kind of fell into the lap of Alexander Fleming. Now, as the story goes, and it sounds like it's probably been dramatized a little bit, Fleming decides to, in 1928, go on his summer vacation and accidentally leaves a petri dish out in the open. By some miraculous thing, some type of spore got there, sounding like probably a penicillin spore, and potentially even maybe beforehand. But the recognition of that when Fleming returned was that suddenly there was this mold spore with a whole area around it where nothing was growing. And this was very uncommon. And so thus it led to a little bit further study, and in 1929 coming out with a paper talking about how penicillin seemed to have some of this antibacterial properties. And in fact, he had been kind of looking into some of this stuff. And again, earlier on, even in the early 20s, potentially kind of latching on to, there seemed to be even within our bodies some of this antimicrobial properties, but being able to harness that has been extremely difficult. Now, we recognize and think about penicillin, especially now we're on this side of the 20th century, that we are like, this must have been a huge, monumental moment. How much penicillin has impacted how we do drugs and even influenced how pharmaceutical companies work. But no, this was not a major moment for that. In fact, for the most part, Fleming's paper, nothing happened to it for almost a decade. There was a few different case studies that showed that there were some additional studies and different things that were showing that, yeah, it looks like penicillin has some abilities here, but nothing really was going on. And in the 1930s over in the UK, there started to be a group of people coming together who wanted to look into a little bit more of how do we figure this stuff out. And we're talking the late 30s here, looking into how do we make progress on taking care of human health and trying to get through some of these bacterial diseases in particular. And they stumble across in their research Fleming's article and state, hey, maybe we can look into this a little bit further. And in doing that, then, they had to figure out how to produce penicillin at a broader scale. And this was a big problem because to this point, penicillin, it was very difficult to be able to create cultures of it. And that's where Norman Heatley helped within figuring this type of stuff out. Then you're taking Ernest Chain, who was another more chemist, being able to look at how do we utilize this within tests. But the lead scientist who was really pushing all of this forward was Howard Florey. And they started doing some tests on mice and noticing that it seemed like there was some really good properties here. But again, it gets to the aspect of it's been very difficult to be able to produce penicillin, much less to be able to give it out. And you got to remember that this is taking place at Oxford, which is in the UK. And if you're remembering your history right, the 40s, especially the early 40s, there's a few other things that are taking a little bit of precedence in what is going on in the world. So this is where they started to actually go to the United States to ask about making sure that they could get funding to be able to look into this research a little bit further. Initially, they went to a lot of the private pharmaceutical companies, and there wasn't enough evidence. There was still so much circumstantial. And again, there had been no human test files at this point. So it was this aspect of, how are we going to do this? What do you mean? And they just said, it's interesting, but we can't support it. So what ends up happening is they end up getting the support of the U.S. federal government, who is kind of trying to look into some of this type of stuff, and then kind of gives them access to their Northern Regional Research Laboratory in Peoria, Illinois. On top of that, then they kind of also, the government kind of reached out to these private companies, much of whom they had already gone to and said, we're supporting this. It might not be a bad idea if you also put in some money, but it's purely up to you, which then kind of also helped perpetuate this, which then meant in the next few years, we went from this aspect of barely having enough and not really being able to do general human research. In fact, there's multiple stories about how some of the first people getting sick and they were taking literally like half of the resource that the U.S. had at penicillin to give it to one person because there wasn't penicillin. They were still figuring out how to be able to use different agar mixes to be able to have much higher producing yield penicillin. And on top of that, even finding penicillin as this mold, which what it is, it's a mold spore, and finding the correct mold spore that was more potent and being able to grow faster, which actually most of the penicillin that comes from today grew on a cantaloupe that they had found at a market. And after scraping off the penicillin, they ended up still eating the cantaloupe. But that's a whole nother story for another day. But it's the aspect of being able to find the right penicillin spores to be able to grow fast, to have more penicillin in them, to be able to break down the cells. And what penicillin technically is doing, it is able to break down gram-positive bacteria, which what that is that there is just a cell wall and then the membrane. Gram-negative being that there is a membrane, then the cell wall, and then another membrane. Penicillin at this stage wasn't able to work well with gram-negative. What it does is it has a marker within it that when the cell wall is going through constant repair, it is able to put something in the process that is allowing for the replication and being able to re-strengthen the cell walls. It's actually blocking that blocker to be able to do that, thus weakening the cell walls, allowing for things to get in and break down those bacteria. So, after discovering all this, after being able to slowly produce this, we go from 1941 not being able to have enough at all for anybody to where it is available for the general public after being utilized in World War II in 1943, available to the general public by 1945. Now, why do I bring all this stuff up? Because there were multiple periods of time where there was needed rest for these thoughts to be able to curate, for researchers, new people to come in to give new perspective, being able to use corn seep liquor to be able to help in the agar mixes to actually produce more penicillin and have a better foundation on which and fermentation process for them to be able to grow. Being able to bring in the additional pharmaceutical companies to actually have bigger tanks to allow for growing this penicillin and having a mission on where it's going to be utilized, and was one of the key things coming from the Allied powers that you were able to have this resource that was able to help prevent some of these basic infections from killing people. Now, granted, we've realized, and just like anything, bacteria continues to evolve, and thus that's where we've been kind of being very wary with how we use penicillin now, because the more we utilize it, things continue to evolve and change, just like you continue to evolve and change with different results coming at you. And how do you think about things and do things within the world based off of your lived experience? The bacteria are doing the same thing. Penicillin is out there more and more that destroys them. They have some type of evolution, some different way to be able to attack. Thus, we have to keep rethinking and reimagining how we do things. But in doing that, sometimes it does take that Sabbath. We had that Sabbath of different times where we'd even discovered there's maybe something here to look at with penicillin, but no one did it. Then we have Fleming actually coming out with that research, and it sits there for about 10 years before anything happens. Then you have this team being able to work together to try to start figuring things out and getting to the point where we had to have other people come in, which they're coming in from their Sabbath. They're coming in from their self-reflection. They're coming in with their different experiences to allow for something like this to happen, and it changed the world over. Especially in the world that we're in. It's really hard for us to take Sabbath. Heck, am a great example of that. I have not done necessarily a great job at figuring out how to balance this podcast and keep going week after week after week and make sure that I have time to recharge. And we'll get into that in a couple weeks here. But I think there's also this aspect even within our church lives, within just our day-to-day lives. When do we actually allow ourselves to recharge? And I think sometimes we can become like the Pharisees and say, well, this is how we do things. This is the way that it's done. This is the process that we have to do. And sometimes the world doesn't work that way. Sometimes the world is evolving and changing, and we need to allow ourselves to take a step back, reflect, and approach it from a new way based off of what we have learned. I think in a lot of ways, the church is at that moment. There's a lot of new and differing opportunities that in the last 10 to 15 years have really become a reality. How many churches now have an online service? What does that mean? What does that look like? Has it changed how you do worship in person and online? Has it changed how you think about organizing a service or even doing things? How about your different outreaches? Is there things that are being thought about and considered in that way for those multiple different congregations? Because if you're doing an in-person and online at the same time, couldn't you argue that's two different congregations at one time? I think these are a lot of questions that at times it's easy for us to overlook. And if we never take that Sabbath, if we never take that time to really reflect, if we never take that time to connect with God, how will we know what to do? How to connect? How do we know that when we're going through our research that, this might be something worth looking into? This Fleming's research here looks quite interesting. I think within our world, within our lives, there's a lot of times that we don't do that. We don't take that time to really reflect and to think about these things. We don't ever give ourselves a true Sabbath. Maybe in certain sections of our lives, but I don't think overall we give ourselves Sabbath. Now, everybody's Sabbath is going to look a little bit different, and I think Jesus is kind of calling that out here. It's not that everybody's Sabbath is going to be Sunday morning. It's not that everybody's Sabbath is going to be at a specific time in a specific place. And sometimes different people's Sabbaths are in different places, and it's finding those Sabbaths and allowing those Sabbaths to happen and figuring out how do we support those Sabbaths. How do we figure that out, I think, is a key thing as we look at the world and the Big C church for everyone going forward. There's a lot that has changed in the last 10 years, and especially in the last 5. We have to allow ourselves to recognize and embrace some of that as well, and not just always hold it at an arm's length and say, well, this is the way that we do things. Because if we do that, it makes it really difficult for us to be able to be in relationship like Hebrews is talking about. It makes it really difficult for us to do what Isaiah is talking about and making sure that we are able to recognize what needs to be rebuilt, recognize the things that God is continuing to bless us with if we never take that moment to breathe. I think also it's recognizing that in that breathing, in that time with God, that's when we're able to actually have the Spirit speak. In those still, quiet moments, that's when we hear what God has to say. And it's hard. It's not easy. But I think it's necessary. Penicillin wasn't this light bulb moment. In no way was it ever really a light bulb moment. It was something that happened over specifically 15 years. And it wasn't just this beautiful growth at a 45-degree angle. It was discovery and then nothing. And then maybe we have something, but we have to figure this all out. And then all of a sudden, bam, we have something. But it wasn't necessarily even the light bulb. It was just, well, we got to test this and maybe this will work. And we got to figure out how we're going to produce enough. And then all of a sudden, bam, we did. And I think that's sometimes what we have to recognize how God works. When we actually give the time, when we actually allow for God to speak, it's nothing and nothing and nothing and suddenly something. So the question I have for you this week is, where do you take and when do you take your Sabbath? Where do you take and when do you take your Sabbath? I think it's something for me I am wrestling with, to be honest. There's a lot of changes that have gone on in my life, especially in the last 2 years, and I'm trying to figure that all out. I'm trying to figure out, how do I take Sabbath in the ways that I need to take Sabbath? How do I make sure that I'm able to continue to provide and give you, the listener on this side, what you're hoping and wanting and needing, while I'm still being able to have enough in me to give? And I think that's something always that I'm working on and balancing. I think that's one of the things, at least within the American story right now, I sense a lot of people are struggling with. How do I live up to everything that God is calling me to be when I feel that there's a lot of these other expectations on me as well that are important, but sometimes it's hard to necessarily get through all these important things to get to the things that God's calling me to do. And it's not necessarily that's the order I want things to be. Sometimes that's the order it has to be, unfortunately. And then we have so many things that are vying for our attention to distract us along that journey. I think there's a lot here to really think about, but I think it centers back to this idea of what is Sabbath. Sometimes we need that time to think and to contemplate and to consider in order for us to actually have the ideas to actually move us forward. And that's essential for what we as people need. So if we allow ourselves the actual opportunity to sit down and breathe and to connect with God and do it on a regular basis and take that Sabbath, who knows what the world will be? Because I think honestly, as I look at the world today, I think we all need to figure out ways to take a little more Sabbath. Who knows what ideas and discoveries will come from that. So, we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.